Hey everybody, I'm going to be joined tonight for the first time I've ever done this for the Q&A session by a friend of mine named Zach Martin, and he is a preacher and he'll be joining me shortly, and we're going to go ahead and we'll talk about what's unfolding in our country right now, some of the current events, and uh, I've invited Zach to get a different perspective than I can offer you and to talk about things maybe in a different way than I can personally. He's a little delayed, but we are getting started, and so I'm just going to kind of start off with maybe some things that will help us have a good discussion once Zach gets here. Some things that I've heard in conversations that I've had with people, some issues that have come up, just some very basic groundwork, because I think tonight the discussion that we have could be one that helps everybody draw closer together. I've seen a few different places, a few different groups of people do things like this, and I've enjoyed getting to hear them, getting a new perspective, a deeper perspective, hearing people's ideas on what justice is, what kinds of things God expects from His children as just people. What does it mean for us to be a just people? To love the Lord with all the heart, the soul, the strength, the mind. What does that look like? And so we're gonna do that. But in order to have a good conversation about that, there are some things that we have to get out of the way. And I only say this because I know with me personally, there are things that I have to get out of the way, or I can't have a good conversation with somebody. And some of the things, one of the things that we have to get out of the way is pride. When we talk about things like we see unfolding in front of us, when people talk about social inequality, or they talk about racism, or they talk about all the different issues that have come up because of what we've been seeing, one of the things that we want to do is defend ourselves and say, well, that's not me. And when we look at some of the things that the Bible says, let's pull up the Bible real quick. When we look at some of the things that the Bible says, first of all, I don't have to defend myself. Right? My salvation does not depend upon me having always been perfect. If there is something that I have ever done in my past that was wrong, I don't have to turn a blind eye to that and say, oh, well, I've never been like that, or I've never done that, I've never said those things. I don't have to pretend like I'm innocent and that I'm morally pure and perfect. That's not what a Christian is. A Christian is somebody who has made mistakes. They have moral failings. They have done things that they shouldn't have in the past. But through Christ, they are forgiven. And that is the thing that unifies and brings all of us together. Because no matter who you are, or where you're from, or what you look like, or what your culture is, no matter who you are, you have fallen short. And it is through Christ alone that we have reconciliation with God. And because everybody shares that fact, that is true about everybody, then that puts all of us on equal footing. And so when we talk about things like this, I don't feel the need to defend myself, right? When somebody says there is social inequality, or there's social injustice in America, or racism is a problem in the United States, I don't have to feel like they're accusing me personally of being the source of all this evil and all this wickedness. We look at the world around us, right? The world is a wicked place. It is full of sin. It is full of bad things. Right? And sometimes I do those bad things. But I don't have to defend myself when somebody says the world is an evil place. It's full of wickedness. Yes, I agree. It is. And sometimes I'm part of the problem. But having been part of the problem, I have found the solution. And the name of that solution is Jesus. And He is the one through whom I have forgiveness. He is the way, the truth, and the life. And so I don't have to defend myself when we talk about these things, because once I start defending myself, I stop listening. If somebody says there's racial inequality in the United States, or racism is still a problem in the United States, the moment I start defending myself, I stop listening. And if I don't listen, then I'm never going to be part of the answer, right? I'm never going to help. If I'm busy defending myself, I will never hear what other voices are saying so that I can help them find justice. And that's a big issue. Another thing is sometimes when we get into these emotional situations, we don't always think the best. And I'm not talking about thinking the best of others. I mean, we don't always think logically, right? Our brain, as soon as you get excited, whether it's anger or deep sadness or even great elation, as soon as you have an intense outburst or feeling of emotion, your brain stops to think logically. Right, and that's just what we do, right? That's just kind of how we're built. We can really only focus on one thing really well at a time. And so if you're focused on being angry, you're not really thinking through things logically. The same thing with all the other emotions. And so when you come to an emotionally charged topic, one of the difficulties is going to be thinking through things logically, thinking clearly. Right? Sometimes we struggle with that when it's not an emotionally charged topic, but especially when it's an emotionally charged topic, we have to figure out some of the impediments, the thinking impediments that will be in our way, and we have to figure out how to remove those. And so before we even get into a discussion that might be emotional or that might cause us to have intense feelings, we're going to try and get some of those impediments out of the way at the beginning. Like one of the things we have to be careful that we don't do is there are certain fallacies, right? Logical fallacies. It's just problems with our thinking that we have to make sure we don't commit. One of those is sometimes called a composition fallacy. And what that is if you see a piece of something, you immediately then assume that all of it is the same. Right? And we do this sometimes, like with sports teams. Maybe when you were a little kid, you went to a baseball park, or maybe last year, I don't know. You went to a baseball park, and one of those Red Sox fans said something really mean to you. And so then you commit, it's called this composition fallacy. You automatically assume that all Boston Red Sox fans are the worst people in the universe. Now, that may be true, but it's not because that one was mean to you. I'm just kidding, right? I don't mind Boston Red Sox fans. But we have to be careful. Hey, Zach, I don't know if I can hear you yet, but you there? Zach has joined us. So I'm going to switch over, uh, turn back over here. Can you hear me, Zach? Yes, no, maybe? It's our first time doing this, so we may have some technical difficulties. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Awesome. Yes, I think we're good to go.
All right. Sorry I'm late.
No, no worries.
We're getting ready to open back up Sunday, so we're doing some final things there. So
Yeah, we are too. We're gonna try it out. Uh, hey, I've been talking for just a little bit about some difficulties that are in our way, like problems with thinking. Why don't you introduce yourself, and then I'll finish covering that, and then we can get started. How's that sound?
all right, sounds good.
All right.
My name is Zach Martin, and I am from Louisville, Kentucky. I preach for the Cedar Springs congregation. I've actually been in Louisville for about 13 years, ever since I graduated from Freed-Hardeman. But I've worked with 3 other congregations. This is my 4th congregation. All 4 of those congregations have been different, which is why I think I have a unique perspective. 2 of the congregations were predominantly white. One congregation was predominantly black. Another congregation was mixed, including the eldership. There was a mixed racial eldership. I have preached for very suburban congregations. I've preached for an urban congregation. And the congregation I'm at currently, even though it's in Louisville, it would be considered a rural congregation, just based on its history and where it's actually located. Louisville's a metro, but it's actually out in the county, close to the county line.
Cool.
So that's a very rural history to it, as well as the members that make up the congregation were rural people, probably up until the 50s, when General Electric and General Motors moved to Louisville. A lot of people from areas such as Bowling Green, which is south of Louisville, moved to Louisville, and they all sing together at this congregation because it was a rural congregation that they were used to. So that's just a little about me.
Cool.
So,
So we are about to dive into an emotionally intense topic, and it was just kind of mentioning that when we do that, sometimes we don't always think well, and just as an example, just because one Boston Red Sox fan is mean to you, that doesn't mean that all Boston Red Sox fans are bad people.
Right.
And so, I mean, we have to get that out of our minds. There are going to be different people in everything that has been going on that have done bad things. That doesn't mean that everybody is bad just because one person does a bad thing.
Right.
And so we have to make sure that we don't make that mistake. Um, Another thing that we need to make sure that we're careful that we don't do is that we don't see different ideas. Like if somebody says, "Well, we need justice," right? And three different people have different ideas of what justice means. That doesn't mean that there's no such thing as justice, right? And so we might call this, I think the formal name is the inflation of conflict, because just because people have different ideas, it doesn't mean that we can ignore the problem.
Right.
So, like for example, uh, the way that police have been treating people is going to come up in our conversation. The fact that there are different ideas about how one can make that better doesn't mean that there's no way to make it better, or that there's no such thing as there's no need for improvement.
Right.
And maybe the last thing to make sure that we don't do is to shift blame. Like if we bring up a problem, right, and there are clearly issues. For the past few days, we have seen some of those issues. By shifting that around and saying something like, "Well, I'm not a racist, but I mean, look at all the problems that you have in your life." You can't do that,
Yeah.
right? So we can't just turn it around and try and point out problems with other people or problems with other groups and say, "Well, we don't have to do anything because those people have done this bad thing." So what? Everybody does bad things.
Right.
We're not excusing the bad things. The fact that people sin, the fact that people make mistakes, doesn't mean that we should stop seeking justice.
Correct. Yes. Yes.
All right. So that was just kind of like putting that stuff out at the beginning to try and get that out of the way, so that we don't have to, so we don't stumble over our own thinking. So that we can begin to have a fruitful and a productive conversation. That was just some stuff that I thought that we could put out there.
All right. Yeah.
Anything you want to add to that before we get started?
No. Well, I would say thank you for inviting me, and I'm excited to be a part of this and ready to go.
Yeah, I'm glad you're here too. All right, so let's. There's racial tension in the United States.
Yes.
What do you mean, like when you hear that racial tension, or when you say that there is racial tension in the United States? What do you mean? Because sometimes I don't know if people are talking about the same thing. The fact that there might be racial tension, or maybe sometimes you'll hear the word bias. The
Yes.
fact that there is racial tension or bias doesn't mean that everybody is a racist.
Correct.
Right. So what do you mean when you say that? If you were to say that, what would you mean? How does that mean in your mind?
So generally, we never think about racial tension until there are riots. So probably the last, well, I was going to say probably the last time we've talked about racial tension would be the Rodney King riots. I don't know if we did with Ferguson. We may have. That may have brought it up. But really, we haven't seen anything like we're seeing now, I don't think, since Rodney King. I don't even think the OJ trial brought about anything like Rodney King. And then before Rodney King, we didn't see anything. I didn't, because I wasn't around. We didn't see anything like it except for 68. So as a historian, what we're going through now looks a lot like 68. For those who lived during that time, of course, with the assassination of Martin Luther King, there were riots and looting. A lot of this looks like 68. So racial tension really, I think for the most part, usually only gets brought up when there's rioting and when there's looting and when there's protests. Not to say that it's not there generally, but it gets brought out. So let's bring up, I don't know if you want to go there yet, but let's bring up George Floyd. So with George Floyd, everyone across the board knows that that's wrong, what the officer did. Whether George was black, white, Mexican, it was wrong. And I think everybody gets that. Mm-hmm. What everybody doesn't get is why is it a racial issue? And because of racial tension, it's an issue. It has brought up racial tension that's usually just simmering underneath to the forefront. And a lot of that has to do with if it was a Caucasian male that was murdered in that way, from the black experience, most people would take the video as is and be done. But when it's a black male like George Floyd, everyone wants to wait and see. You don't take the video for what it is. Wait and see for the autopsy. Wait and see if maybe George Floyd has a shady background. And all of that is always underneath. And something like George Floyd brings that to the surface.
Right. So just to make sure I'm understanding you, within the, your experience in the black community, their understanding is that, like, if it had been me, people wouldn't be digging through my background to find out if I deserved it.
Correct.
Right.
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
And there wouldn't be a need for 2 autopsies. Like, your family probably would not do a private autopsy like Floyd's family did. They would just take the medical examiner's word for it.
Right. So would you say that there is a, trying to put words to it, a at the very least, right? At the very least, a perceived injustice or a perceived bias in the system.
Yes.
Okay. Yes. And I think, if we're honest, we kind of get programmed with that bias.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And I don't think I'm speaking out of turn or saying anything, but my wife and I were talking about this, and she mentioned that she kind of gets programmed with that. We just do, right? From the movies we watch, from the way the news is reported, right? There's just all this information coming in, and one of the conversations we had was, we were talking about this very thing, and it came up. Who would you rather be in a dark alley with? What would make you more nervous? What person would make you the most nervous? And really, the way it ought to be, anybody in a dark alley, right, should make you nervous. Right? But we kind of get programmed, and is that sort of the bias or the tension?
Yes, and that's where systemic racism comes into play. I know that was one of the questions that you sent me. That really is what makes systemic racism systemic, because whether you know it or not, that was passed down to you. Mm-hmm. We get it in media, we get it in TVs and movies, but also just as a society in general, that gets passed down. Who would you not want to meet in a dark alley?
Right.
And that is what brings, I think that's what keeps the tension there, because as a black male, I have to think about daily, do I go here? Do I go there? What time do I go? All of that plays a part in systemic racism.
And I don't think about that.
No, and you don't. Yeah. And I do. That's a part of my culture, and that's just a part of being black in America.
If I want to go for a walk at 10 o'clock at night, I don't think about it. I just go for a walk.
Yes, exactly. So, because this is a rural congregation, we have lots of land. I live in the parsonage, which is on the campus. And when I first moved here, I didn't think anything really about it. Just doing my daily exercise, walking around the campus, which makes a great circle. But I got to thinking, especially when it got to be the fall of the year, and I'm walking around, in a hoodie around the campus, what does that look like? And you may say, well, why do you have to? Because number one, I'm at a congregation, and everyone, even though they may not know anything about us, if they lived in this area long enough, they know that it's a predominantly white congregation. We've been on this property since 1919. So
Wow.
you know that this is has always been since 1919 a predominantly white congregation. So if you have a black guy walking around in a hoodie, I've got to think about that.
Right. And
Even
when
though
you
not,
say that, right,
I've got to think about that.
and when you say that though, like we're talking right now, you're not saying Stephen Cuffle, you're a racist, and I have to do this because of you, right?
No, 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 not at all.
And
Uh, yeah, I don't have anything to follow up, but no, not at all. That's not because of the whole white race. It's just a part of the American experience.
right, and I guess that's you mentioned that systemic part of this. That it's
Yeah,
just there are lots of people who maybe wouldn't care,
right,
but somebody might.
correct. And one of your questions was concerning have things gotten better,
Mm-hmm.
for African Americans in this country, and the answer is yes, things have gotten better, but um, those who are racist and have found legal ways to be racist. So
Right.
there's redlining when it comes to housing and just other systemic problems. I think when some people talk about systemic racism, it gets mixed up with institutional racism. But systemic and institutional really are two different things.
Gotcha. So what would you? So we're talking about this idea of your experiences in our country are different than mine, right?
Correct.
In the 10 minutes we've been talking, you've highlighted some things that are different than my life. And so if somebody were to say, "Well, I don't really experience racism in my life. I just don't see it."
Correct.
How would you I don't want to say how would you respond to that, but what are some ways that you could help somebody who maybe says, "I just don't see that." How could you help them to understand, what you just described?
Okay. So let me state this. Not every black person's experience is the same.
Right.
Just as you asked, do you think I'm a racist because I'm white? No, I don't. And so on the flip side, don't think that every black person's experience is the same. And again, I'm not trying to speak for the entire black race,
Right, just
but
for you.
what I think is needed, especially in the church, is just the acknowledgement that racism is still there. Would help a whole lot. So again, not my experience is not like other people, not even my own cousins. Like I throughout the last week or so, been talking with cousins who grew up in the same town, and at an early age, they were called the N word. I really don't think, and I may just have blacked it out. I really don't think I've ever been called that to my face. I don't have that experience. I'm from Tennessee, small town. I don't have the experience and I don't mean to stereotype people, but I don't have the experience of having a run in with what we may call quote unquote a redneck or a good
Mhm.
old boy. I don't have that experience. But has there been some things in my life where I think back and think, yeah, that was probably racist? Yes. So we don't all have the same experience, but and you as a white individual may say, well, I don't see racism, and that may be fine and well, but acknowledge that racism is a sin, and a sin is not going to go away until Christ comes back again.
That's
So
right.
this world and this country, especially this country, will have racism because it's a sin and it won't be completely dealt with. Yes, Christ has dealt with it on the cross, but it won't be completely dealt with until he comes back.
Yeah. And I think that's what you just said, that it's a sin. That is where I think that we, as the church, as believers, that's the way we have to approach this. You know, I've been telling people that I have been having conversations with that my involvement in any of this, you know, my stance on any of these things is not political.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
not. It's biblical.
I, I don't know why this is the only issue that we've relegated to government. And I don't know the political leanings of anyone that's listening to this, but we always, as far as a people, historically, religious people have always our First Amendment right, separation of church and state. But for some reason, we want the government to take care of racism. And secondly, we get bombarded. Again, I don't know anyone's affiliation, but I can tell you that Fox News and MSNBC are not going to talk about racism from a biblical worldview.
Right.
So stop listening, whether it's Fox or MSNBC, or whether it's protesters or those who are anti-protesters. They're not going to come from a biblical worldview. And for some reason, we will say we will take their point of view on that. But if we talk about abortion or drinking or homosexuality, we want a biblical worldview. But for some reason with racism, we don't want the biblical worldview.
Right. And I think that's the only way that we as believers can make progress.
Yes.
Is we have to address it the way the Bible addresses it.
Yes.
And I think if we did, I think that there are some answers there that, like you said, I don't think it's going to make anything go away. Otherwise, we've had 2,000 years to get rid of sin.
Exactly.
Right? It'll go away when Christ returns.
Exactly.
But maybe there are ways that we can improve our lives as believers, and in doing that, be a light.
Exactly.
In the world.
And the first thing to do is, I think, to admit that it is a sin. And then it may be one of those issues. Again, I don't know why we take this to be some sort of magical pill. Like once you're in the water and you come up, if you are a racist, it's all gone. It's not. It's like anything else. You got to mortify the sin, Romans 8, daily. So some people may have to mortify that sin of racism daily. You got to deal with it. You
Right.
got to deal with it.
So let's start for just a minute, and let's just go through a couple places in the Bible where we
Okay.
could say, where we could look at it and we could say, this is why racism is a sin. So I would go, in my mind, the first place I think of is going back to the Bible, to Genesis, or the very beginning, when God makes humanity, and He says, "Let us make humanity in our image, after our likeness." Right? My Bible says man, but it's the word for humanity there.
Right.
Not male, but humanity.
Right.
And let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and all these things. And then verse 27, so God created man in His own image. In the image of God, He created him, male and female, He created them. So we're all made in God's image. And to mistreat anybody who is made in the image of God, that's wrong.
Correct. Yes.
It doesn't matter what you look like, where you're from. You are made in the image of God, and that gives you value. And for me to take away your humanity is a sin.
Yes, it is. Um, and we don't see racism until after the fall, which connects it. One For me, one of the greatest connections between Old Testament and New Testament is in Genesis 11 with the Tower of Babel. So everyone was one until they're starting to build this tower because of pride, which is sin. So they're separated. God takes them all over, no longer one people. So then we start to see, the superiority of one race over another. But then when you get to Revelation and John sees every tongue, tribe, nation, and people in heaven, how did they get there? Well, reconciliation.
Mm-hmm.
It's the gospel. That's what the gospel does. We're separated in Genesis 11, but then in Revelation, we're all back together as one people because of the gospel.
That's right.
And when people say that it's not a gospel issue, you got to take it up with Christ because of his death, we get Revelation, a picture of heaven, which every tribe, tongue, nation, and language will be there in one place together.
Yeah. And that's an interesting picture, isn't it?
Yeah.
It still has, in that image, it still has all the nations.
Yeah. So some people say, and that may go back to your previous question where they don't see racism. Some people say, well, I'm just colorblind. That takes the pendulum the other way, because when you say that you're colorblind, you may not mean to, but you're actually denying the beauty of a diverse creation.
Yeah.
God has made us diverse for a reason, for a purpose. So if you say you're colorblind, you're denying God's diversity in his creation.
Yeah, it's like most things, right? You can't go too far either direction, or you go off into trouble.
Well, my favorite not an illustration, but my favorite quote, Martin Luther said that theology is like a drunk man on a horse. So the drunk man gets on one side, but then he always falls off on the other side. So is it with everything in life, but especially with theology. If we're not careful, we're like a drunk man on a horse. And
That's right.
can do with this as well.
We've got a couple comments that we'll acknowledge because I want to involve people in our discussion.
Yes.
And one of them we may have to come back to, but one of the comments when we were talking earlier, Nick Gill said that the system is not monolithic, and that's right. Right, different experiences, different people.
Yes.
It's not everybody is the same.
Yes.
And that's kind of what you were just talking about. There's this beauty in diversity. Unfortunately, when sin enters the world, sometimes we all experience sin differently. So different experiences.
Yes.
And then Jonathan had a question, and maybe we can talk about this toward the end. I think we're going to work up to something like this. He said, I'm not sure if this is the direction you want to go, but do you think that racism is why we tend to have white and black congregations? Or is it a cultural thing? He said, I've heard that there are differences in culture, and many times that's the reason why two churches won't merge together. And so is there a need or a biblical call to merge and come together? And he would like to understand that better, or at least our perspectives on it. And
you want to tackle that now?
What was that?
Do you want to tackle that now?
Should we get to the end first? Wherever you want.
It's wherever. It's whatever you want. The only reason I asked is because we were on the diversity issue.
Yeah. All right. Let's talk about that right now.
Because in one of the questions that you sent, someone asked, well, why don't they just come and join us? So there is beauty in diversity. Unfortunately, what happens, and this is a part of systemic racism.
Let me read the question so that people know what you're talking about.
Oh, go ahead.
So all week I've been gathering questions And one of the questions that I got was, let me see if I can find it. Do you remember what number that was?
Oh, I don't. I'm sorry. It was an earlier question that you had sent. Let's see here.
So we've got a list of questions that we've been sending back and forth.
Number 8.
8. Okay, so the question, somebody sent this in, and I'm going to reword it. The question was, so there is these divisions that you'll see. Sometimes you go into a town and there'll be a white church and a black church. And why can't people just get over that? And why can't they just, the question was framed as, why can't they just come join us? And so that's the question that we're talking about. So go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt.
This is one of those things I'm very passionate about because I grew up and my parents, my grandmother did not see color. I grew up going to all types, well, not all types, just 2, but white and black VBSs, gospel meetings. We visited. I grew up in a county with about 40 churches of Christ, 40 congregations. So there's always something happening. So it didn't matter what color you are. If there was something happening, we went. So I've always been very passionate about a multi-ethnic, diverse congregation. And so in my 20s, I was really passionate about it. Again, this, Michael Ferguson and all these things came up, and I would push this. But a very wise minister that I love dearly, we were sitting and talking one day, and he says, "It's great, but it shouldn't be forced. It should be organic." And that really got me to thinking. I guess now that I'm in my 30s, I've cooled down and really a diverse congregation should be organic. And so, no, you shouldn't go throughout your town and letting all the congregations be one, close down this church and that congregation. Let it be organic. If you're in a town and you don't have any African Americans, that's fine. As long as your congregation is sound, y'all are still going to heaven. Don't go out. And I know we used to have bus ministries. If you want to do a bus ministry, that's fine. But don't do a bus ministry just so your congregation can be multi-ethnic. Let it be organic. Okay. But here's why, especially a lot of African American congregations are, and I'll say this, they are against it probably more than our white brethren. And that's because it goes back to systemic racism. Because what happens when an African American congregation joins a Caucasian congregation, their culture disappears. It's gone. It becomes, the white congregation becomes a very patronizing congregation. And I don't mean that negatively. I just mean sort of like back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s with Brother Marshall Keeble, and how the white congregations would support him sort of in that way. When a black congregation joins a white congregation, the white congregation be the father figure. And everything that the white culture does is the right way. And so they no longer can sing the songs that they've sung or sing it the way that they've sung it, or there's no meshing of cultures. And for that reason, I think a lot of African American congregations are, and I'll say totally against merging, because they know when they merge, and we grow up like this. There was an experiment done in the 30s. If a black girl had her choice between a black doll and a white doll, which doll would she choose? Mm-hmm. And she would choose the white doll because that's the right one. That's the perfect one. That's the it standard of dolls, not the doll that looks like her. And so diversity is great. So when we're thinking about merging congregations, uh, we need to merge cultures, and we need to compromise. Now, it gets much deeper than that, because there may be some things that a black congregation does that the white congregation doesn't see as an expedient, but they see it as going against the standard of God's worship. So it's a whole mess of things underneath that.
Right.
But the main thing is that the white way has always been for us the right way. So we get lost in that.
Right. And I guess
So
that's why you feel like you can't force it.
yes, it has to be organic. Yes, definitely has to be organic, because if you force it, all of the black culture is forced out. And what you have left is the same congregation you started with. You just have African Americans in your congregation. And is that really what the congregation should look like? No, I think it goes back to diversity. God has made us all different for different ways and different purposes. So that needs to be shown in our worship as well.
Right. Terry Francis said that they had a group of black members join when he was in Memphis, and he said that their amens bothered some of the people, but he loved it, and they kept it. And so it
good,
right. But I mean, that comes back to what you're saying. Not everybody's experience is the same.
Because some examples may be a little touchy, but yeah, that's an example. Is an amen expedient, or does it go against what Paul says? Let's do all things in decent and in order.
Right.
And so for a lot of people, amening is not indecent and in order.
Right. And that comes down, like you were saying, that's really a matter of opinion.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And that I could see how if that's kind of the culture that you're used to, it's part of your service together. That I have been somewhere where that did cause friction, and I mean, there's a lot. Like you said, there's a lot to overcome. You can't just mash people together and expect everything to just be perfect.
Correct. So probably if you're looking at merging, and I think sometimes we merge out of necessity, like a congregation is shrinking and can't pay the bills and what else. But if you're truly wanting an organic merger, it will probably take a few years. That is, you all going over there, they coming over to you, all these different fellowship times, and learning each other's culture. Because if the first Sunday, if you have a black brother get up to lead singing, he's not going to lead singing like you've been used to. And that's really going to cause friction if you're not used to him leading singing. So that's why it's going to take a couple of years to really have a good organic merger of congregations.
Yeah. Somebody made a comment that Dan King said, "I wish that we would amen more." I agree with him.
I agree. I have one lone brother that amens here, and I'm trying to get the others to do so. It makes a world of difference. But again, I've had a sister ask before, when Paul says, let all the women keep silent, does that mean I can't say amen? So you have those different issues. So in a black congregation, the women will say amen. But in a white congregation, even if you have the brothers saying it, you may not have any women saying it based on Paul's instructions to women. So it's no one said this is going to be easy. So don't go into it thinking that it's going to be easy. It's not.
Yeah. So let's start off some more practical things.
Okay.
Talking about racial tension or bias and how it's there. It may not always be as visible, but it's there. Right? If I recognize, and we looked at some places in the Bible, if I recognize that that's wrong, what are some ways that how could I get better about that? What are some things that I can do? I can't make the world get over it. I can't.
No. Okay.
So that's a fool's errand, right? But in my life, how can I reduce, my own bias and how can I maybe help to ease tension with others. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
So the first thing is, and again, I think we want to make sure that that biases in general are different than a racism. That there's just some. I said in a podcast this week, we all have prejudices. We all prefer something over something else. Like if you're from the South, you prefer Duke's mayonnaise uh, over the other mayonnaise. I don't know. I'm from the South, so it's just Duke. So you prefer Duke's over something, and so we all have biases. Where racism comes in is you believe because of your skin color that you are superior, whether it's in thinking or in doing. So when it comes to racism, the first thing that you need to do is repent. Really is the first step. Again, this may be something that you deal with the rest of your life. Uh, Christ says it's better to go into hell maimed than to have all your limbs. So you may be limping into, better go into heaven maimed than hell whole. So you may be limping into heaven, but at least you have your Christian life. You've been mortifying this sin, putting it to death. So the first thing is to make sure that you are repenting, and you may need to repent every day of this sin, mortify it, put it to death. But what's important is that you find someone that you feel comfortable with that's of another race, and you sit down and you listen. That's all that needs to happen in the beginning, is that you sit down and you listen. And then when you get understanding from those talks, I think then you're ready to dialogue with that person. And then you can start working out your biases. I can't be specific. I don't know if you want me to be specific. Again,
Yeah.
not everyone's experience is the same. So that's why listening and dialoguing are so important for you to realize, okay, what areas I need to work on, and then you work on them.
Yeah. I think that probably general advice is better right now because we don't know.
Right.
I know that I have bias. I don't even know what all of my biases are, but I know
Right.
I've got them.
Right.
And so I like that advice of listen to people. Go find people who have a different experience than you and just listen.
Just
Don't
listen.
Yeah, don't talk, don't argue. Just listen. That's hard to do.
Which is why it's probably, besides repenting, the most important step. I mean, you're going to have humility. You're going to have to go to somebody who may not know that you have these certain thoughts of superiority and say, listen, hey, you don't have to probably go into your background, but just say, I have these biases, and they may be racist. Can you help me in understanding what's going on? When we talk about white privilege, it goes back to the drunk on a horse. White privilege doesn't necessarily mean that you are racist. I think white privilege is also part of systemic racism. That it's just a part of your American experience you may not know. So you may have somebody that's listening, and whenever they hear the word white privilege, I mean, they are just so tender-hearted. I have people here, and I know you do at your congregation, that any sin that they think that they've committed, I mean, they just go to pieces. So when you hear white privilege, and if somebody says, well, that's because of your white privilege, don't necessarily think that you are the head of the KKK. Because it may just be because you're born into this system. You don't have any racist bone in your body, and it's just because of the systemic racism and some institutional racism that it may come off as white privilege. But again, this isn't just for our white brothers. This is for our black brothers as well, to sit down with someone of a different background and ethnic group and get to know them. Because again, I like Martin Luther. The drunk man can go on the other side, and we can look at everyone and think that every white person is racist, and they're not.
Right.
They're not. So we need to also sit down and listen to our white brothers as well.
Yeah. And that ultimately just comes back to what you said at the very beginning. There's different experiences.
Yeah.
And I have to, if I want to understand where somebody else is coming from, I have to understand their experience.
Yes. And unfortunately, news media likes those big, bold experiences that not everyone in America has.
Right.
So when you look at the news, you are seeing the extremists. Now, that doesn't mean that it didn't happen, but you're only going to see the extreme sides on the news, whether it's conservative or liberal. You're only going to get the extremes because we live in a world, a polarized world today. There is no middle ground on anything. So,
right.
Yeah, that's why I say cut off Fox, cut off MSNBC. You're not going to find a middle ground there. You're just not.
Yeah. So then the next thing that I thought we could do to help, so that was one thing, is just become more aware of people,
Yes.
of your brothers and sisters, your fellow human beings. Listen to them. The second thing, or the next question would be, what can I do? So that's how I would become more aware of it. What can I do to lessen it? And again, not talking about fixing the world. Can't be done. But within the sphere, my little sphere of influence, with the people that I know or that I meet, what can I do to lessen it? And I'll give you maybe an example of kind of what I'm thinking of. The best way that I have been able to think of to lessen bias or tension or even outright racism is to just love people and to just show them love, like you see, Jesus talk about how the greatest two commandments are both about love.
Mm-hmm.
Love God, love other people. And then in that love, that'll lead you to treat people the way that you would want to be treated if you were in their position. And so we'll pull up the Bible real quick. Over in Matthew chapter 7, where we've got the golden rule.
Mm-hmm.
I was talking with one of my brothers on Sunday about this, and Jesus says, "Whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets." I don't know anybody who would want to be treated like an other.
Yes.
I don't know anybody who wants to be treated like that. We all want to be treated like we're a human being, like we matter, like we are of equal standing.
Yes.
Everybody wants that. And one of the things that really changed the way that I think about Matthew 7:12 is kind of what it seems like Jesus is saying is I don't need to go around and treat everybody exactly the way that I need to be treated, but there is a way that I would want to be treated. And so I have to figure out what that is for you. I need to learn who you are, what you like, what you don't like, and then I need to treat you the way that you want to be treated. I mean, there may be words that I might say that don't mean anything to me, but to you, they're terrible.
Yeah.
I need to learn that, and I need to quit it.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I'm not loving you. And so that would maybe be the place where my mind goes in thinking, if we would really learn how to love each other, that'll fix a lot.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you have anything to add to that?
I just tell the people to live out the gospel which it seems simple, but we don't do it. Especially
Yeah.
people of the book, New Testament Christians, we don't do a good job of living out the gospel. And what I mean by that is, everywhere I've been, I've always told my people, every morning you wake up, you need to rehearse the gospel to yourself. And the gospel, of course, is much more. I think over time we've simplified the gospel to just the events of the gospel, which is the death, burial, and resurrection, but it's much more than that. So when I tell my people to rehearse the gospel, it's where they in the gospel, meaning that according to Ephesians 2, we were all dead in our sins and trespasses. Romans 5, while we were still helpless, Christ died for us. So Christ died for us, right, which should humble us. That when we were dead in our trespasses, when we deserved the wrath of God, he saved us, which means we were nobodies. So who are we to think that we are superior to anybody else? We're all at one time were walking zombies, right? We were all doomed to hell. So that should humble us. So throughout the day, I mean, we're just walking around trying to, as you say, love people, show them the love of Christ. We think about the people who gave us the gospel. So we in turn give others the gospel because we know what it is to live without the gospel.
Yeah.
Now, it's a little bit harder for those of us who grew up in the church, I think, to get this, but it should still be humbling to know that even though I grew up in the church in a good home, if I died outside of Christ, that didn't save me. My good home, my good Christian home and parents, and my good sound congregation would not have saved me if I didn't obey the gospel. And
Right.
so just rehearse every morning the gospel and remind yourself that the gospel is for all and that outside the gospel, we're all the same and that we're all doomed to hell. We all deserve the wrath of God without the gospel. So and see people through the gospel. I mean, if you see
Yes.
someone through the lens of the gospel, then you're seeing someone that is doomed to hell. I've used this illustration before. If you live each day looking through the lens of the gospel, then you are seeing people out on the ocean without a lifesaver, and you have the lifesaver.
Yeah.
So what are you going to do? Are you just going to float on by? And that's why I say we don't do a good job with the gospel. Because most of the time we float on by. And we may think, well, someone else will come along and give them a lifesaver or a wrath. Well, someone gave you a lifesaver. Someone gave you a wrath. Someone gave you the gospel. And if it wasn't for them, you would be drowning like everyone else. So see people as souls. I
Yes.
think it's very important.
Yes.
Don't see skin color, see them as souls.
And that, I think, brings up another really important biblical principle of judging with righteous judgment, like Jesus will say over in John 7, or looking past physical things. I mean, you think about what is racism. Somebody I heard describe it a couple days ago as it is an entirely physical construct.
Yes.
It is making judgments about somebody based on the way they look.
Yes.
It's absolutely a physical thing. And if we can learn to see people, I like the way you said that. If we can learn to see people through the lens of the gospel, to judge with that righteous judgment, it doesn't matter what they look like.
I mean, this way of thinking is not me. This is all Christ. This is what got Christ killed. I mean, he
That's
saw
right.
people. He saw people as souls, and he judged the Pharisees with the righteous judgment, which is why they got upset when Jesus reminded them of their history when Elijah did not save anyone in Israel during Ahab's time, but God sent him to Syria uh, Elijah didn't name him, but Elijah was sent to the Shunammite woman and healed. Like no one during Ahab's time was healed in Israel, but all the healing was done for Gentiles. So, I mean, Jesus had to deal with it, and it's not new, and it won't ever go away. But we judge people on their souls, not on, and we don't judge really. The word judges them, but the righteous judgment is the true judgment for
Yeah.
people.
Learning to see like God does.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
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 And I like what you said. This is a new problem. I mean, you can see it before Jesus. You
Yeah.
can see it in the Old Testament. You can see it during the life of Jesus.
Yeah.
And I came across a quote by a Christian living in the 100s. His name is Justin Martyr. And he said, "We used to hate and destroy one another and refuse to associate with people of different races or countries." He says different tribes, but we kind of translate that into modern English. Now, because of Christ, we live together with those people and we pray for our enemies. And so, I mean, even you can go all the way back to the first century or second century where the modern concept of a race didn't exist yet. People still thought in terms of tribes, but
Right.
the tension is still there. I mean, they still hate each other.
Yeah.
And he says Christ fixed it for him personally.
I mean, if Peter had a problem with this, who are we? You know,
That's right.
I know a lot of people who want to deny racism will say, well, Peter is an ethnic problem. They all looked alike. It's just that different backgrounds. Well, no. Peter thought that he was superior when other people were around. Racism, it's not just about race. In this country, it's about race, but it's just about being superior to other people. And I don't want to say it's just about race in this country. Charles Darwin made it about race all over. And you can even go further back to some of the Enlightenment thinkers, those that we think were enlightened, but they thought that the white European race was superior. So it's about superiority.
Yes.
Most of the time it's about race, yes, but racism is also about superiority.
Yes. And that I think is maybe why having that biblical foundation of we're all the same. We're all made in God's image. There's nothing that makes me better than anybody else.
No.
We're the same.
We are the same.
Yeah. That was pretty much all that I had. We kind of covered those questions that I sent you.
Okay.
I didn't really highlight those. Is there anything else that you wanted to address or that you wanted to touch on?
Well, the number 8 is one that we did cover about the diversity of
there is one thing, at least one more thing that I wanted to ask you about.
Okay.
Because it has become not necessarily where I'm preaching right now, where I'm a member right now, but I have seen it become an issue with brothers and sisters in various places.
Okay.
And it's the Black Lives Matter, that phrase. You know, somebody will say Black Lives Matter, and then a response has been all lives matter. And both of those things are true.
Yes.
Right? And somebody who says Black Lives Matter, why don't you? Why would that be? I'll let you explain it.
Okay.
Why might that be not a good thing to say? Like if somebody were to say Black Lives Matter, why is retorting, well, all lives matter?
Because whether you know it or not, you're showing that all lives, which really boils down to white lives, especially if you're a white person. If you're a white person that says all lives matter, to a black person, you're really saying white lives matter, which brings back that tension. You're denying that there is a systemic problem in America. And that's really, again, it's a spectrum. I mean, for Black Lives Matters, you have your peaceful all the way up to your looting. It's all over the board. But overall, Black Lives Matters is just a it reminds us that there are some issues that the Black experience has that says that we don't matter. So then when you deny that, you're denying that we matter.
Right.
Um,
And it's not even necessarily that I am trying to do that.
no, no.
It's what it communicates.
Yeah, because we would agree that all lives matter, especially from a Christian worldview. We agree that all lives matter. That's why we fight for the unborn. That's why we fight for the aged. You talked about Justin Martyr. If you look at church history, it was the churches that established hospitals and orphanages. And most of our big cities, hospitals are named after denominations. So the Christianity as a whole has always been about all lives. But when we say Black lives, we want you to know that we really do matter, because through systemic racism, or even through what we saw with George Floyd, we see that a lot of times our lives don't matter.
So a couple comments that I'll read. Jonathan said, someone worded it this way to me. We would never show up at a breast cancer awareness event and say, how dare you, all cancer is bad.
Yeah.
Right. And so that maybe is a way that we could explain it, where people would understand how offensive that would be.
Yes.
And then Terry Francis said, Black Lives Matter. Also, it's not excluding other lives. It's pointing out the importance of Black lives.
Right. And it may be, Stephen, that the person that says all lives matter may be that colorblind person, which denies diversity in Christ. So even when you're saying Black Lives Matter, you're reminding that there is diversity in Christ. So to say all lives matter, you're negating even God's plan of diversity.
Yeah. And I think maybe part of the difficulty is that phrase has been politicized.
Yeah.
It has become a political statement, and it shouldn't be.
Correct.
I should be able to say that without people, I've been accused over the past week or so of being way further left on the political spectrum than I am. I'm not going to use the phrase that was used to describe me, but I was described being way further left on the American political spectrum than I am. And I am mostly an apolitical person. I feel like I am part of a kingdom that is much more important.
Right.
And while I'm glad that we have the right to vote, I'm glad that our country is set up the way that it is. This isn't about politics.
Right.
And trying to make it about politics. I don't want to say disingenuous, but at the very least, it misses the point. I'm not trying to get a political party into power. I'm not trying to sway your vote for president. I'm trying to teach what we see God telling us in the scriptures. And
right. And I don't want to get off on this hobby horse, because it is a hobby horse of mine. But where we are at today really shows us why David Lipscomb was so adamant in Civil Government and other publications on the church's involvement in government.
Yeah.
I don't mind saying it. I'm a Lipscomb follower on that. And so I don't think I don't, everybody can have their different views. And so I don't force that view. That's just the way that I've gone. But we can see why he was as apolitical as he was.
Yeah.
And how the church was the church perfect? No, because David Lipscomb still had to write people up about not accepting people of color into their congregation when they didn't have their own congregation. So, but maybe we were closer to the kingdom view when we were all apolitical, but that's for a different time.
That's right. That's a different conversation. Yeah. No, but I see the wisdom in it.
There is wisdom. So
yeah. Was there anything else? There's a
Yeah.
couple. Let me read a couple more comments, and then I'll let you finish this up.
All right.
Um, Terry Francis said Jesus isn't colorblind or wasn't colorblind because he pointed out the difference between the Jews and the Samaritans.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he highlighted the difference in the parable of the Good Samaritan. Nick Gill said that no one gets mad when a fire truck drives past all the other houses to try and rescue the house that's on fire. You know, nobody says all houses matter at that point
Right.
because we
Right.
see that one is in distress.
Yes.
And then Simon has a question that we're probably going to have to talk about another time, and it was about whether or not there are races or ethnicities. And we've talked about that a little bit, but I think that that's a much broader question.
Yeah.
And Simon actually works in Oakland, I think, if I remember right, and he works with youth in Oakland.
Okay.
And so his question is geared toward that work.
Okay.
Maybe we could get together and talk with him sometime about that.
Yeah.
But then I'll be quiet now, and I'll let you finish us up. Is there anything
Well,
else that you wanted to talk about?
Yeah. The only other question I wanted to deal with was the question on monuments, and we may not have time for that. But I just wanted to give a perspective. So my background, I didn't go into my educational background, but I have an MDiv in biblical and theological concentration, and currently I'm working on a THM in church history, hoping to move on to a PhD after this. So church history is my life. And so on one hand, I am sad that there are monuments that are being taken down, but I have to ask myself, why were they put up in the first place?
Mm-hmm.
So we've lived with these monuments forever. The question is, why were they even put up? And of course, that gets into another conversation on the lost cause and how after Reconstruction, the South rewrote their history. And so in rewriting history, these monuments became almost worshipped as gods of the Old South. And so from the Black experience, when we see these monuments, we see people who wanted to keep us in chains and who fought to keep us enslaved. Now, I know the lost cause will say, well, the war wasn't about slavery. And they'll talk about how Lincoln changed his views and all of that. And they'll talk about how Robert E. Lee was going to release his slaves when he died and all that. And that's fine. But from the Black experience, those monuments were put up to honor people who fought to keep us enslaved, and for people who lost a war is a bit strange. Also, there aren't monuments, and this is a classic example. There aren't monuments to Hitler, and I thought about this just the other night. If there was a monument for Benedict Arnold, the monument wouldn't be put up in order to give him honor. The monument would be put up as a historical marker saying, this is Benedict Arnold. He betrayed us. He was a traitor. Now, if the monuments were put up like that, this is a part of our history. We lost the war. This guy did great things, but this was some of the bad things that he did. All for it. But that's not why the monuments were put up.
Yeah, there's a difference. I was talking about this with some people recently also. And again, this isn't political. There's a difference between something that is done in memoriam, like the Civil War happened. It was an event.
Yeah.
Here is a battlefield.
Right. Right. And so monuments at battlefields are fine, but including my own hometown, I mean, there were monuments downtown and there were big parades and big to-dos about this lost cause.
Yeah, there's a difference between remembering something
Yes.
and honoring it.
And honoring. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so if you go back and you look at the reasoning behind and what's so interesting, Stephen, is that, and I know someone may come back and say, well, the South didn't have any money, but a lot of these monuments weren't put up until the turn of the 20th century, like 40 years after the fact. So you got to ask yourself, why 40 years? And what was going on politically, what was going on in writing history, and all of that to really come to the truth.
Right.
So on one hand, as a historian, I am sad. This is what we've always lived with. But for my brothers and sisters who do feel that, they don't look at it from a historian's point of view. They look at it as an oppressor, as people honoring an oppressor. Then I have to take my historian eyes off of it and sympathize or empathize with them over it.
And that's why maybe it's important to realize this isn't political, this is spiritual. And if I have brothers and sisters, and that's the thing, you're my brother, right? We aren't members of the same religion. We're not affiliated. You know, you are my brother. We are part of the same family.
Right.
And if there is something, you know, in my little nuclear family, right? If there is something that is causing one of my children distress,
right,
I will get rid of it. Who cares about the politics of it? It's this person who I love is deeply hurt by this thing. Right. So I make it go away. Right? Yeah. I do that for my children. They're part of my family. If I have brothers and sisters who honestly are, and I can't, you know, they'll tell me, right, that I have to go back to what we were talking about. You know, I have to listen to them.
Yeah.
And if they say this hurts us, and here's why.
Yeah. Unfortunately, because it is politicized, it's politics that are taking these monuments down. But we got to bring this back to a biblical worldview, as you said. We got to get the politics out of it. Unfortunately, that's the world we live in, and it's politics that are making these decisions. And again, as a historian, I hate it. But then I also know that these monuments have caused deep issues with brothers and sisters in Christ, and you don't ever know. And this can be monuments. This can be the flag. The Confederate flag. You don't know that your pursuit of keeping these historical tokens could keep someone away from Christ. And so that's we've got to again think about souls,
right,
in all of this. So I don't appreciate people tearing down the monuments and profaning them and all of that. I'm totally against that. But if for the majority of the population they cause hurt, then we've got to put our weaker brothers before us.
Yeah. And me, or just an example, let's pretend it didn't offend me at all, but here we are, we're in a family together, and it just for the sake of argument, it highly offends you, then I should give my voice, I should lend my voice to you so that we can go through proper channels,
right,
to have things, to make things better.
Right. And here's the thing we miss oftentimes with the stronger brother and the weaker brother. Nowhere in any of those passages, because Paul deals with it in both Romans and 1 Corinthians, nowhere does Paul say this brother is going to stay weak for the rest of his life. No. So, but with you compromising and you helping your weaker brother, you're helping them grow. And maybe later down the road, monuments may come, whatever it may be, can come back, whatever it may be, because the ideal is not to keep him in that state. You're taking away the stumbling block in order for him to grow. And that's where the dialogue comes back in it.
Yeah.
You're not just going to take away the stumbling block and huff off in a corner, but you're going to take away the stumbling block, and then you all are going to study and work together in order for him or her to grow.
Yeah. And again, that's bringing it back to the spiritual perspective.
Yeah.
I really appreciate that.
Yeah. I don't know. For some reason, we just think this weaker brother is going to be weak his whole life, but that's not the point.
Yeah, that's not the goal.
That's not the goal. Is in order for him to grow from that. So
right. Well, I don't have. Was there anything else you wanted to cover?
Let's see. Let's check here. I think that was it. I definitely, of course, again wanted to talk about the merging of the congregations. I wanted to make sure I got the monuments. I think we've talked about experience enough. I know that somebody asked, haven't we come far? I think we've gotten that.
Mm-hmm.
Is it okay to join a protest? That's going to be a conscience decision, just like it's a conscious decision for me to follow Lipscomb's view on government. Joining a protest is going to be a conscience view. I will say be careful because we are to abstain from every appearance of evil. So make sure that the protests that you are involved in are the peaceful protest. There's no looting, no rioting, none of that. So just be careful about appearances is what I would say there.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about what to do besides protesting. That's probably good.
Okay. Well, hey, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. I'm sorry I was late again.
No, don't worry about it. This was a better conversation because you were here. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. Again, just for those who are listening or watching, just know that I don't speak for everyone, and remember that we all have different experiences. Just listen to those different experiences.
Right. All right. Well, we'll leave it there. Maybe we can get together and do this again sometime.
All right. You just let me know.
All right. Thank you very much for joining us. God bless everybody, and I hope this has been beneficial.